Good evening, and welcome to the first program of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan's 2021 8-week Great Decision Series, with topics suggested by the Foreign Policy Association of America. I'm Michael Van Denen. I am the Executive Director of the Council. On behalf of my colleague Erica Kubik and the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council, I welcome all of you. Thank you for adjusting with us as we program responsibly in this time of COVID-19. We hope that you will stay safe and show grace to those in your community. Council's mission is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We do this with the help of 50 area businesses, 11 educational partners, and many community members. Together, we seek to provide programming that is civil, credible, objective, relevant, and compelling. To change the world, we believe, one must first know the world. Tonight, we say thank you to Wolverine Worldwide as our series sponsor, to Blue Lake Radio and the Community Media Center as media sponsors, and the Friends of Great Decisions as our topic sponsor. After Ms. DiMaggio's presentation this evening, there will be ample time for questions. You may type them into the YouTube comments section or text them to 616-308-6560. And please remember our house rules to exhibit civility to our guests and hospitality to others by asking respectful and succinct questions. We're pleased to have Suzanne DiMaggio with us, and we are grateful to her for her flexibility to engage us in this format. She is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she focuses on U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East and Asia. She is one of the foremost experts and practitioners of diplomatic dialogues with countries that have limited or no official relations with the United States, especially Iran and North Korea. For nearly 2 decades, she has led conversations to help policymakers identify pathways for diplomatic progress on a range of issues, including regional security, nonproliferation, terrorism, and governance. Suzanne directs the U.S.-Iran Initiative, which is carried out through a combination of policy dialogue, research, and a series of private roundtables and public events, all with the aim of exploring possible grounds for constructive engagement and generating diplomatic solutions to the issues that divide the two countries. The project's centerpiece is a long-running dialogue that she established in 2002, which helped to provide the foundations for the secret talks between Iran and the Obama administration that led to the 2015 nuclear agreement. She is currently directing a U.S.-North Korean dialogue that has included several visits to North Korea. As part of that process, she facilitated the first official discussions between the Trump administration and the North Korean government in Oslo in May of 2017. Suzanne is also the chair of the board of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, an action-oriented think tank that she co-founded in 2019. The Institute seeks to lay the foundation for a new foreign policy centered on diplomatic engagement and military restraint. Her presentation tonight is titled North Korea, Getting Diplomacy Back on Track. We welcome Suzanne DiMaggio, and Suzanne, welcome to a gathering of West Michiganders.
Thank you so much, Michael. Greetings, everyone. It's such a great pleasure to be included in the World Affairs Council series of events on global issues, and to kick off the series, I'm humbly honored. I'd like to extend thanks to Michael and Erica Kubik for inviting me to be part of this series. I'm especially inspired by your tagline, know the world, then change the world. To me, these are words to live by, and I try to live by them, so very inspiring. So, as many, if not all of you know, North Korea has been one of the thorniest foreign policy challenges facing the United States, perplexing American decision makers for decades. Every US administration submits what's called a national security strategy to Congress This lays out what that administration sees as the most serious threats to US national security and how it plans to deal with them. North Korea is consistently included in this assessment. The most recent NSS, which was unveiled by the Trump administration in December 2017, identifies North Korea as a top threat, describing the country's nuclear and missile programs as a most pressing challenge to American national security. And we should anticipate that the Biden administration will reach a similar conclusion when it puts forward its own national security strategy. Some of you might be surprised to hear that the US and North Korea are technically still at war, since a peace agreement was never reached following the Korean War 70 years ago. And to complicate matters, the US does not have diplomatic relations with North Korea. We do not have an embassy or diplomats on the ground in North Korea. It's one of the few countries that were not present. This means that communications are extremely limited, and communications have become even more difficult during the COVID pandemic. So against this backdrop, I've been asked to explore whether there is a possibility for the US to get diplomacy with North Korea back on track. My short answer is yes, but it's very complicated. I'll conclude my remarks by mapping out what I think could be a potential way forward. But let me begin with some background first. I'll begin by reviewing and assessing US policy toward North Korea over the last several years during the Trump presidency and the current state of play. And then I'll move on to examine the potential for a new approach under the Biden administration. So let's start with Trump-Kim symmetry. Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un had three encounters, much publicized encounters during the Trump presidency. The first was an historic summit held in Singapore in June 2018. The second summit took place in Hanoi, Vietnam in February 2019. And following the lackluster outcome in Hanoi, a third very brief encounter occurred at the Korean border in June 2019. This is when Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim met and shook hands. So what has been the outcome of these meetings and the exchange of letters between Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim? To briefly sum up, although tensions remained largely under control during this time of engagement, really no concrete progress was ever actually achieved. There was a moment there where we did receive the remains of servicemen who served in the Korean War, but that was cut off rather abruptly very early in the process. In fact, the North Koreans throughout this process continued to advance their nuclear and missile capabilities. And during the nearly 3 years since the Singapore summit, the North Koreans have kept themselves quite busy on this front. They have rolled out new weapon systems, including a short-range ballistic missile that appears designed to evade US and South Korean missile defenses. And experts estimate that the North Koreans have produced enough fuel for perhaps 2 to 3 dozen new nuclear weapons. At an important gathering called the 8th Congress of the Workers' Party of North Korea, held in early January, Kim Jong-un doubled down on a strong national defense, and he outlined goals that were focused on further modernizing North Korea's military. He specifically called for the development of tactical nuclear weapons. This generally refers to shorter range and lower yield nuclear weapons, as well as longer range and more advanced ballistic missiles, which ostensibly could reach the United States. The party Congress culminated with a military parade that included the showing off of some shiny hardware, including a new submarine-launched ballistic missile and short-range ballistic missiles. So despite sanctions, which are quite severe, Kim Jong-un seems undeterred in his pursuit of stronger missile and nuclear capabilities, presenting a determination to prioritize guns over butter. So for the next part of my comments, I want to focus on the view from Pyongyang. Given this backdrop, what is the point of view of North Korean decision makers? I'm going to focus on three key points that I've had discussions with North Koreans about and that they've conveyed. And I think they carry important implications for US policymaking. The first is that North Korea sees the United States as an existential threat to its survival, regime survival. North Korea officials see their nuclear weapons and missile programs as the only reliable means to deter US aggression and the only source of security against regime change. They have concluded that the United States will not attack a country that has nuclear weapons, plus the means to deliver them. They point to the examples of Muammar Gaddafi of Libya and Saddam Hussein in Iraq as cautionary tales. The assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Quds Force in January 2020, has only reinforced this view. The second point I think that's interesting to call attention to is their rejection of what is known as the Libya-style approach. By that, they mean Muammar Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons, and yet he did not end up in a good position. The North Koreans dismissed the Trump administration's approach to talks, which they saw as this Libya-style approach, because it insisted that the North Koreans fully denuclearize, as well as give up their missile, biological weapons, and chemical weapons programs before they receive a single concession. They said that they will not agree to a process that provides no security assurances to safeguard their regime and no opportunities to address economic challenges early in that process. Instead, they say they're looking for a step-by-step process that will lead to a fundamental change in the US-North Korea relationship. More specifically, they favor a phased approach that incorporates political, security, and economic measures towards the establishment of a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. The third point of discussion focuses on lessons learned from the Iran nuclear deal. So Pyongyang has been paying close attention to the Trump administration's withdrawal from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and they have drawn a number of negative lessons. A key message they have taken from it is, even if you abide by your commitments, the US can still renege, violate the terms of an agreement. There are also concerns about carrying out irreversible measures. The US commitments outlined in the Iran deal were temporary, mainly sanctions relief that were easy to reverse, as we've seen, while the Iranians carried out commitments that can be viewed as irreversible, such as disabling their plutonium facility. If Iran were to decide to rebuild this facility, it would require years and substantial funds. So following this Iranian experience, the North Koreans have expressed reluctance to take any similar step that would be difficult to reverse should a deal fall through. Next, I'm going to briefly assess the Trump administration's approach to North Korea. Given these perspectives from the North Koreans that I just outlined, it's clear that the Trump administration's negotiating stance towards North Korea was deeply flawed. Pyongyang's threat perception would never allow them to accept an approach that requires essentially the wholesale abandonment of their nuclear program up front. The Trump administration's refusal to consider concessions such as sanctions relief as part of this negotiating process was a miscalculation, and I think an obstacle to testing whether diplomacy can really work. On the other hand, I do think engaging at a leader-to-leader level was quite a bold move by the Trump administration. The aim was to forge, at least on paper, it was said, a new kind of relationship. The US demonstrated that it was willing to sit down with a long-standing adversary at the very highest level. And the summits between Mr. Kim and Mr. Trump symbolized a breakthrough in relations, but they ended up revealing the limits of such personality-driven diplomacy when it's not backed up by extensive preparation and negotiations, as well as, importantly, realistic expectations. So simply put, the formulation and execution of a coherent strategy beyond the hype and the summitry was sorely lacking. At the Hanoi summit, the US insisted, as I mentioned, that North Koreans fully denuclearize upfront. The so-called Libya model that was championed by John Bolton. The North Koreans responded by turning the tables on the Trump administration, insisting that the US meet all of their demands to drop the US hostile policy before they do anything on disarmament, let alone denuclearization. So clearly both are unproductive and untenable positions, which have resulted in an impasse that continues today. If the purpose of an excessively coercive approach was to constrain the development of North Korea's nuclear and missile programs, it failed rather spectacularly. While it's true that Kim Jong-un has nothing to show in terms of economic progress for his engagement with the US, which of course is very problematic for him, what he can show is clear advancement in North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. I still believe that the decision to engage directly with Kim Jong-un was the right one, but I'm only going to give the Trump administration partial credit because it was executed rather poorly. Personality-driven diplomacy has resonated with Kim Jong-un, and it signaled that the US was ready to try to forge a new kind of relationship after decades of hostility. But it never gained traction because the key ingredients were missing. It was not backed up by a coherent strategy. It was not backed up by a unified and empowered negotiating team. And it was not backed up by realistic goals. So looking ahead, I hope the act of meeting adversaries carries over to the current administration, but that is done in a responsible way that actually advances US interests. Following the pageantry of 2 summits and a handshake at the DMZ, I think we now need serious diplomacy to manage the uncertainties ahead. So how likely is a new approach under a Biden administration? So let's put this question in context. President Biden has entered office at a moment of unprecedented and intensifying crises, a daunting array of domestic challenges, a spiraling COVID pandemic, where a year into this pandemic, it's still not under control. The US death toll is approaching now 470,000 people, and the rollout of the vaccine has been very slow. Also an economic crisis, and COVID lockdowns mean more restrictions on economic activity. We're also a country riven by political division, a violent insurrection. A second Trump impeachment hearing will begin in the Senate in just a matter of hours. An alarming number of people believe that the election was stolen from Trump. And racial divisions and social upheaval. These divisions are animated by a white supremacist movement. So this is a collision of serious crises, and Biden's immediate focus rightly is on our domestic situation. I haven't even mentioned the range of challenges in the arena of foreign policy. China will likely dominate the foreign policy agenda, repairing and strengthening our relationships with our allies, addressing the global climate change, not only managing the current pandemic, but preventing a new one, and so forth. So given this large agenda, there will likely be a resistance to expending any bandwidth or political capital on an issue as dicey and unforgiving as North Korea. Even so, I think a strong case can be made for starting a process with the North Koreans early, and I'll make that case in a minute. First, I want to bring a wild card into this scenario gazing, and that wild card, of course, is what will North Korea do? Since the failure of the Hanoi summit, the North Koreans have pulled back from official engagement with the US. Talks hit an impasse. Interactions have been virtually very limited and virtually none at all. The stalemate has been hardened by the COVID-19 pandemic. As he enters his 10th year as North Korea's leader, let's take a look at Kim Jong-un. What kind of position is he in? Well, he's shown himself to be a resourceful pragmatist who stands to maintain a strong position for the foreseeable future. And although North Korea continues to face serious vulnerabilities, including a troubling economic situation, extensive flood damage, serious food insecurity, and of course the coronavirus, the leadership's staying power should not be underestimated. I think once the pandemic eases, Chinese assistance to North Korea will resume. The bite of sanctions will continue to diminish due to successful evasion strategies and lax enforcement. And South Korean President Moon Jae-in will be keen to advance inter-Korean relations during the year or so he has left in office. Steady, unconstrained advances in North Korea's nuclear and missile programs, as well as conventional weapons, are translating into a growing threat to the United States and our allies, while providing Kim Jong-un with the confidence to continue to step out on the world stage. So it still appears that Kim may have left the door open to diplomacy with the United States. No doubt this is due to a mix of motives. He has a clear desire to modernize his economy, which he admits has not happened over the past several years. Reflecting traditional North Korean concerns about Chinese influence, he may hope to avoid over-reliance on Beijing. And very aware of the power imbalance with the United States, Kim may see diplomacy as a useful tool to keep Washington at bay. Now, the case for a new approach. While he was a candidate for president, Joe Biden wrote, quote, "I'll engage in principled diplomacy and keep pressing toward a denuclearized North Korea and a unified Korean Peninsula while working to reunite Korean Americans separated from loved ones in North Korea for decades," end quote. I think this is the right starting point. So what would a principled approach to diplomacy with North Korea look like? I have some ideas. First, I think that the Biden administration's early moves can help shape an atmosphere conducive to testing whether a serious diplomatic process with Pyongyang can be initiated and sustained. A range of measures can help prepare the groundwork to advance US interests. I think that the Biden administration should make an early approach to the North Koreans to test whether a serious diplomatic process can be initiated and sustained. There's a strong possibility that Kim Jong-un will make a provocative move, such as launching an ICBM to advance his threatening arsenal and create negotiating leverage at some point during Biden's first few months. To head off such a move, I think it would be wise to signal to the North Koreans very quietly a serious interest in engaging in a strategic approach to revive diplomacy before Pyongyang forces a crisis. In other words, avoid getting bogged down in a time-sucking escalatory ladder by taking a proactive stance. As part of this outreach, I suggest reaffirming the principles of the 2018 Singapore Declaration. This was the single sheet of paper that came out of the first summit between him and Trump. It was negotiated and signed by Kim Jong-un, and that fact alone means that it matters to him. This could form the basis for building an achievable negotiating agenda going forward. Some might believe, since it was something that happened during the previous administration, it should be discarded, and I would strongly disagree. In this one-page document, the US and North Korea agreed to establish a new relationship and work together to build, quote, "a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean Peninsula," end quote. And Kim pledged to, quote, "work towards the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula." And President Trump committed to providing security guarantees to North Korea. Now, why it's somewhat of a flimsy document, it's by no means a roadmap or even an agreement. I would call it a statement of early principles, something to build on. The other thing that I think should happen quite quickly is to seek an early understanding whereby the US and South Korea would continue to suspend the major military exercises that we normally do if North Korea maintains nuclear and long-range missile tests suspension of those tests. I think maintaining this dual suspension could help provide space to explore diplomatic options. I think another key element of this approach should be communicating, again, very quietly, a clear break with the previous administration's maximalist approach, move away from the so-called Libya model, and move towards a stepwise process. And the establishment of a peace regime, which is the North Koreans' top priority, should be on equal footing with the US's top priority, denuclearization. This would really be a turning point in the approach to North Korea. The goals of a first phase peace agenda could include things like a declaration that finally ends the Korean War, issued by both the United States and South Korea, and then move towards more detailed negotiations in close coordination with Seoul to reach a peace treaty. It's been nearly 7 decades since the Korean War ended, and it's time to move forward with a peace declaration. The other thing that we could explore is a pathway to expanding diplomatic relations. I think the US could quickly move to open a liaison office in Pyongyang so that we do have a diplomatic presence there. That would certainly help ramp up communication. And another point that I would emphasize is the establishment of people-to-people contacts once the coronavirus concerns are eased. This could help facilitate the reunion of Korean Americans with relatives in North Korea, as well as a range of other types of exchanges, academic, athletic, cultural, technical, and so forth. Another important element to a new approach would be, we really just have to face facts and acknowledge that denuclearization is just not a realistic goal. Washington's objective of complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization, also known as CIVID, is simply unachievable. I think we should have denuclearization as a long-term goal to happen sometime in the future. And in the meantime, set achievable goals, an action for action approach with some incremental benchmarks and flexibility to manage setbacks. For example, the goal of this first phase of a denuclearization agenda should emphasize things like halting the development of new warheads and long-range missiles, slowing the production of fissile material that can be used to make nuclear bombs, and building some transparency. I think this is a much more realistic approach. Another element I would emphasize that I think fits very well into the Biden administration's stated approach, that is rebuilding confidence and coordination with our key allies, namely South Korea and Japan. Ending alliance tensions that have increased over the last several years would be essential. Finalizing military burden sharing agreements with South Korea and Japan will help to alleviate tensions. And I think the US and South Korea could cooperate. In fact, that cooperation should expand to ensure a common approach for moving inter-Korean dialogue. This is dialogue between North and South, moving that forward and a peace agenda forward. Resuming trilateral session will reassure Japan that its interests will not be left behind. Another element in this is we have to bring in China. We should work with China, but we should keep our expectations in check. Beyond our allies, any stable solution to security issues on the peninsula will require Chinese cooperation. But any expectations for Beijing to play a very active, constructive role should be minimized. While likely viewing a nuclear-armed North Korea as a useful geostrategic pawn in Sino-US competition, China will still be motivated to restrain Pyongyang from provoking a crisis or triggering US moves that would undermine its security. So even while seeking Chinese support for diplomacy aimed at strengthening the common goal of stability, the US will want to avoid steps that would place Beijing in the driver's seat or give it undue influence over events on the peninsula. So admittedly, what I've outlined is quite a complicated picture. The degree of difficulty on a scale of 1 to 10 is a solid 10. Some would say it's off the charts at 11. But if we're serious about building peace on the Korean Peninsula after all these decades, it is going to require thinking creatively, learning from past experiences, learning from mistakes, and committing to a process of complex diplomacy. So just to conclude very briefly, it's true the Biden team might be less than excited about pursuing a proactive approach to North Korea. But one key lesson we have learned over these years is that the longer we kick this can down the road, the more limited our options become. Our options are shrinking, not expanding. And given the tenuous communication channels in place, we could slip back to a ratcheting of hostilities quite quickly. Remember fire and fury, including once again spiraling towards military confrontation, either by design or perhaps more likely by miscalculation. So preventing such a scenario should be a priority for all of us. I think the Biden administration will be well served by developing and committing to a diplomatic strategy to manage the uncertainties ahead. A pragmatic, principled diplomatic strategy could help break the impasse in talks between Pyongyang and Washington. We now need to fully test if diplomacy can work. Changing the nature of the relationship, such a hostile relationship, to one that is perhaps a little less confrontational, a little less contentious, will take time. So we need to demonstrate commitment to sticking with the very difficult process over and over again. So I think I'll stop there, and I really look forward to questions and comments.
Suzanne, thank you very much. It was excellent, excellent overview. I took so many notes. I was writing on every piece of paper I had in front of me. uh, Fabulous, wonderful. So many things to engage you with. And I want to remind our listeners that you can text 616-308-6560 to ask a question or write in the YouTube chat box. That will be a way to present a question to Suzanne. And to start with a follow-up, I had noted too that it was July 27, 1953 that the armistice was signed. So we're officially in a state of war with North Korea right now. And I'm wondering, you mentioned that as one of your suggestions of some conversations about that. What are the pros and cons with this? I'm sure that it's perhaps easy to make a statement like that, but it comes with a lot of baggage, I imagine, both pro and con. Can you talk about that a little bit? You seem to recommend that there should be some conversation about officially ending the war.
Yes.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
So you're right. I mean, 70 years is quite a long time to be in a state of war. It's perpetual, endless war. It's the longest endless war we're engaged in technically. And I remember when I was in Pyongyang once, I was sitting at a table with North Korean officials, and they took the time to remind me that we were still at war and I was technically in the country as an enemy combatant, which I really appreciated them reminding me about. But what I'm suggesting is a declaration first. And this would be not a very big deal at all. I mean, this is just a political statement, particularly if Washington and Seoul were to work together and say, look, the war is over. And I think the benefits of that clearly outweigh the downsides. And what we're seeing now is that if you look at public opinion polling, when this question is asked here in the United States, there's overwhelming support. I think the American people understand that it's time to do this, even symbolically. And we're also seeing some activity in the US Congress where this is gaining some support. Not only among Democrats, it's mainly Democrats, but even some Republicans are now signing on to it. So that's a first step. This would then trigger um, deeper, in depth conversations and even negotiations about what that would mean and what it would entail. Because keep in mind, we have UN forces in Korea overseeing the DMZ. There are a lot of technical aspects to this that would then need to be negotiated. And certainly we would need to engage the North Koreans on this. But I see the declaration as a first step, a political statement that says we're committed to finding a long-term solution to the hostility and pursuing a stable peace regime on the peninsula. I think it would be important for first and foremost, the people of North and South Korea, but also I think for us Americans. The war has been a long legacy, and I think the time has come for us psychologically to say we want to pursue a peace agreement.
So why hasn't this been done yet? Is it because politicians are afraid of looking weak in this conversation?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is that it's viewed as a concession. It's viewed as giving up something to North Korea without getting anything in return. And I would really push back hard on that. I think it's something that we're giving to the people of South Korea and the North Koreans who suffered greatly through that war as well, but also to us here at home, where we're saying this is an endless war that's gone on too long, and it's time to end it. So I think it is the appearance of looking weak that we're giving something up, but 70 years is a long time. It's really time to end this.
Question from somebody who's watching: do sanctions work here? They don't seem to have had any effect on what's going on. Is there any other leverage beside sanctions?
Yeah, so there are very few points of leverage, and sanctions are so favored, especially by representatives in Congress and our Senate, because it gives them something to do. It's actually something in their purview that they can do and take action on. But here we are now with the North Koreans, and what we have seen is that sanctions lose their bite over time. The North Koreans they're facing the most extensive sanctions regime, one of the most, I think Iran is the other. And what have they done? They have found workarounds to these sanctions through criminal activity, corrupt practices, and other means. And what else have we seen? We have seen the countries of China and Russia um, not enforcing them as strongly as they used to. There was a peak period early in the Trump administration where a new round of sanctions and everyone was behind them and they were enforcing them to a greater extent. But I think it was seen that a real solution wasn't being pursued in a serious way, they started loosening that enforcement. And keep in mind, and the Chinese do not want to see the North Korean economy collapse altogether, because that would create a humanitarian catastrophe right at that border. And where would these people go? Probably into China. So they have a vested interest in some economic stability. So what I think has happened is over these last years, although the previous administration engaged North Koreans, they were not willing to really give up anything in the area of sanctions. And what I see has happened in the case of North Korea, but also in the case of Iran and Venezuela, sanctions during the last administration have become the ends instead of the means to an end. Sanctions are put in place as leverage to be able to lift them to help change policy or change the behavior of an adversary. And if you're not willing to do that, then they are the end goal. And then we have to be, I really feel very passionately about this, to have such extreme sanctions against a lot of these countries during a global pandemic a deadly coronavirus pandemic is really inhumane. Blocking any medicines, medical equipment, access to vaccines. I just don't, I think that's anti-American. And I'm happy to see that the Biden administration is now reviewing these policies. They're too draconian, and I think they're looking to enable the transfer of humanitarian trade as an exception in these cases.
Thank you. Are there diplomatic embassies of other countries in North Korea? If so, which ones? And could any of those be used as a door for the U.S.?
Very good question. So they're limited. I don't know the exact number. I'd say maybe maybe 4, 5, 6 dozen, maybe 5 dozen. And from all parts of the world. And we do have a protecting power in Pyongyang. That's the Swedes. So the Swedes have a small embassy in Pyongyang. And when I've gone to visit, normally when you visit a country, you check in with your embassy. Since there isn't one there, I go to the Swedish embassy. So they are protecting power in North Korea, and they do serve as a basis for communication. When the North Koreans detain Americans as prisoners or hostages, the Swedes are there to ensure that the individuals get consular services, consular visits. So they take on that responsibility. It's very similar to the role the Swiss play for us in Tehran.
Great, thanks for that. Any chance that there'll be a return to, somebody referred to the sunshine policy, that in the late 90s, South Korea opened up a bit more to North Korea, including some economic exchange? Remind our listeners, what was that about, and did it have any effect?
I think there's a chance to return to some elements of that. Although I do think in some circles, the sunshine policy maybe has a bit of a negative connotation because it ultimately did not work for various reasons. But when we look back in the last few years, one of the areas where the North Koreans wanted sanctions relief was in order to do economic exchange with the South Koreans. And Seoul also wanted this. It was Washington that stood in the way and wouldn't let this happen. So there were a number of joint economic projects along the border. By lifting some of these sanctions or even just easing them or issuing waivers, that joint economic activity could have started. I think that was a big miscalculation on the part of the Trump administration. I think we should have allowed those sort of joint projects to move forward. They're confidence builders, and they're not a threat. So that was a big mistake. And also, it really caused the North Koreans to cut off the dialogue with South Korea. There had been an inter-Korean dialogue that was happening, a process of reconciliation that was actually bearing some fruit along the DMZ. And when we refused to help ease those sanctions, that dialogue has been cut off, and it's been cut ever since. So I do think, looking at the policies of the current South Korean President Moon Jae-in, who's very pro-engagement, and he's already had a conversation with President Biden. I think their foreign minister and our Secretary of State have had conversations, and I think they will be looking for ways to coordinate much more closely along the lines that I outlined in my remarks. I think this is absolutely essential. We should be coordinating very closely with Seoul as we move forward with any engagement with the North. And this simply just did not happen over the last few years. It was not as coordinated as people might think.
Is there a strong sense of nationalism among the North Korean populace? How are, as far as you can tell from your visits there and whatever, what do the North Korean people make of all of this? And counter, what about South Koreans across the border? What are the sense of the Korean people about engagement?
Well, I have to just preface a little intro about my visit. So when I go there in the past, I haven't had free reign. So I can't just go to Pyongyang and travel the country on my own or at my will. So it's a very heavily minded visit. It's at the invitation of the government. Minders are always with me. So I'm really only seeing a real slice of life in Pyongyang, the capital. And that is the life of the elite. I mean, these are government officials and others who were doing pretty well. I mean, each time I've gone back, I've seen more cars, more cell phones, more cafes and restaurants. But, I have never really had access to just how ordinary North Koreans live. So my picture is kind of skewed, but based on what I've read, um, it's it's there's no public opinion polling in North Korea. It's very hard to know what the average North Korean thinks about engagement. And because they are cut off uh, from the rest of the world virtually, they don't have opportunity to travel. There's no educational exchanges. We just don't know what they're aware of and with the outside world. So that's a very open question. I think others would know more than me. But in the case of South Korea, I think what we're seeing, there was a point when the idea of reunification between North and South, in the South Koreans viewed that very favorably. But I think there's been some generational change. Let's face it, the majority of people now living in South Korea were born after the war. They didn't experience that period. It's sort of like something they learn about in a book or they hear from their elder family members. So I don't think the notion of reunification is as pertinent as it once was. But I do think the idea that there should be less hostility, some peace declaration, and a pathway to a peace treaty. I think younger generation people really get that and feel the importance of it.
Well, you've got questions. We could keep you here well into the evening.
Okay.
uh, what about somebody's asking about North Korea's illicit activities, their human rights violations? You mentioned that they're getting around sanctions by doing some illicit things. How does U.S. and other countries handle that that side of it? You're trying to uh, uh, reapproach, you're trying to make things better, but there are all of these illicit and not so great things going on. Do you talk about them? Do you bring them up? How do you address those?
Well, I think there's no question that the government of North Korea, one person, an expert I admire, described North Korea as basically a international criminal organization. So there is a high level of corruption. There's no and illicit activity. There's no question. You see their diplomats overseas. They're not just there as diplomats. They're there to earn hard currency, one way or another. How do they do that? Maybe engage in illicit trade and so forth. So there's no question about that. And of course, the human rights situation. Human Rights Watch's recent report, consistently their reports show arbitrary detention, imprisonment, you name it, disappearance. People don't have certainly rights that we enjoy. So when I'm engaging North Koreans, you have to raise this in a way that, you want to get into a conversation, a discussion, not just lecturing. It's very difficult to do because sometimes the officials you're dealing with, they just don't want to talk about it. Either they're not authorized to do so or they've been actually told not to. So it's a very difficult situation. The one area where we have had extensive conversation is when they have detained American citizens. And that's when I feel very at ease, pressing for an in-depth discussion on how, what are they charged with, how are they treated, getting them released. Just informal conversations about that, I think, is very important. And in terms of what leverage do we really have to change the human rights situation in North Korea? Very little. And in fact, the one tool we always use, which is sanctions, well, guess what? Sanctions are a very blunt instrument. And even when you attempt to target them on the elite, inevitably it's the people that suffer. We've seen this time and time again. Just what's happened in Myanmar recently, where there's been a coup, a military coup. And, a lot of we hear from our congressmen, Congress, and senators is, oh, we need to slap on sanctions right away. Wait a minute. These countries are among the poorest, people are among the poorest. They don't have rights. These rights have been taken away and they're suffering through a pandemic. So let's not have that knee-jerk reaction. But that's one of the tools that we always reach for. I take a long-term view to these countries that I deal with. I would include Iran in the same situation. And that is, we have to find a way to change the fundamental nature of our relationship with these countries so that, I'm not saying get to normalization really quickly, or certainly not become allies anytime soon, but just become slightly less contentious. So maybe we could start having these sort of conversations. And of course, we can support some of the international mechanisms, like the UN has special rapporteurs on human rights. We can press these governments to allow them to have access to these countries to make fact-finding missions and so forth. So we can have influence at the international level, work together with other like-minded countries. But at the end of the day, our leverage is quite limited.
Yeah, you mentioned Myanmar, and that's another question that's come up. Listener says, given the recent events in Myanmar and the closeness of the relationship between North Korea and Myanmar, vis-a-vis military equipment support and maybe assistance to them for arms production, what are the strategies that the Biden administration might have to deal with what's going on with Myanmar and how that affects the relationship with North Korea as well? You mentioned that sanctions is really, a terribly blunt instrument, particularly in a pandemic. So are there any options out there?
So in the case of Myanmar, keep in mind that the head of the military is already sanctioned by the US. These guys are already under targeted sanctions. So we could certainly go down that road to the extent if there's anything left. But some of the broader based sanctions that I've heard people talk about, I think would impact average citizens in a very detrimental way. So that's why I'm opposed to that route. But in the case of Myanmar, when nearly 10 years ago, when they started this transition toward democracy, part of us lifting some of the sanctions was that they had to meet certain benchmarks. It was an action for action approach. And I really advocate something similar with North Korea. So they did something and then we lifted some sanctions or eased them. In the case of their cooperation with North Korea, that was certainly a major interest of the Obama administration. More transparency in that relationship, cutting it off. There were rumors that Myanmar had tried to obtain nuclear weapons from North Korea and so forth. So that's the benefit of, if you have sanctions, lifting them is you can get things in return. So they shouldn't be the end policy goal. And I think in the case of North Korea, these last few years have really been even though we have these lovely photographs of handshakes and love letters and in Bob Woodward's book that he outlines and so forth, it really has been a very coercive approach. I don't really think we've tested diplomacy fully with Kim Jong-un. And I think we really need to. He's quite a different fellow. He's not his father, and he's not his grandfather, the founder of North Korea. He's relatively young, mid 30s. He's, you know, of a different generation. And he also probably would like to see his reign continue for the next 50, 60 years, which is quite a long time. So I think there's an understanding there that maybe exploring a better relationship with the US, getting sanctions relief, delivering on economic development to some extent would actually help solidify his regime. I think we need to fully test it. I think this last few years was the start of a test that went seriously awry, and I think we really need to have more realistic expectations and fully test it.
Thanks. Someone's asking about North Korean strength in cyber weapons and how does that factor into the diplomatic conversations?
Well, the cyber is not my area of expertise by any means. But what I can say is one of the reasons I favor a incremental approach to the North Koreans, and in some circles, when you say we should drop complete verifiable denuclearization as a near or even medium term goal, that is like heresy. I mean, in some rooms you get laughed out of the room, but I strongly believe it. It's not going to happen in the next year or two, 10 maybe. But what it can, if we drop that as a goal and instead put other goals into place, like a discussion on cyber, for example, beginning discussions with the North Koreans, pursuing that as a more short-term type of discussion on the agenda. That's what we could pursue. The other thing I think we should be pursuing with the North Koreans is a discussion on non-proliferation. What would it take to get their assurances and verification that they will not sell or share nuclear material, technology with third parties, other countries or other third parties? Same with biological and chemical weapons. These are the sort of discussions I think we should be pursuing with the North Koreans. And of course, we have to pursue discussions with them that they're interested in having. They want to know what kind of security reassurances we can provide them. That's the type of discussion they would like to have. So I think the focus exclusively on complete denuclearization has in the end prevented us from exploring these other topics that I find very important to US national security.
This is the last question here, and it kind of go together, and you touched on it before with the peace treaty, but I think that piqued people's interest here, our viewers, about that. So one person asked, other than a psychological win, what would a peace treaty between North and South Korea really accomplish? And related to that, what do you believe is the best case scenario? What do you believe is the best case scenario if a peace treaty was signed?
Well, what a best case scenario would be, first, a peace declaration is different than a peace treaty. So a peace declaration, which I think could be done quite easily, is a political statement. A peace treaty would actually involve negotiations, and the parties to the armistice. So after the North Korean War, instead of reaching a peace treaty, we put in place an armistice, which is basically a ceasefire. And the signers of that were us, the South Koreans, of course, the North Koreans, the Chinese, and the UN is a party to that too. So for negotiation and talks on a peace treaty, I think we would, those parties would need to come together. There are also some Europeans that served. One idea is those countries that served in the Korean War fought would also be parties. So there's a number of European governments and so forth. I think that's actually a good idea to make it a multilateral initiative. So that's really what it would take. And maybe the UN could be, it could be under UN auspices or set up another multilateral venue in order to do that. And I think that, what would it trigger? It would really trigger conversations about the military presence on the Korean Peninsula. Who would, if there is a peace treaty, is there a need for the presence of UN forces? And if so, what would that be? Would it be reduced? So it would trigger conversations on all these questions. And also, I think a big part of that conversation would be, what are some confidence building measures that could be put in place? And what are some communications channels that could be put in place to ensure that we continue to have these discussions? Putting a real institutionalizing it in a way, I think, is what would be helpful.
This is a question from a curious listener. Do you consult with either the Biden administration or the Trump administration? In other words, do you work through official channels, or is all of your work back channel effort?
So my work is completely unofficial. It's called Track 2 Diplomacy. And in the case of North Korea, also my work with Iran, it's actually technically Track 1.5. I know it sounds extremely wonky, but Track 1.5 means, the participants on their side are government officials. So in the case of North Korea, there isn't a tradition of non-governmental organization or independent think tanks the way there is here. So you're essentially meeting with government officials in their unofficial capacity, they say. So the upside of that is you're actually meeting with policymakers and having access to them. The downside is, you don't get a range of views. In the case of Iran, when I'm meeting with a group of policymakers, say, 5 of them, it's not uncommon to hear 5 points of view or 5 variations maybe on a theme is more accurate. In the case of North Korea, when you're meeting with a table full of officials, you're hearing 1 point of view, just one. And that is, the official line. There's very little deviation from that. So I'm there as an unofficial, and it's informal. I'm not there representing the government. I'm not there negotiating even. It's really an academic exercise to a large extent. And my own personal way of approaching this work is I do keep the sitting administration in Washington informed of what I'm doing. I work in a bipartisan way. It doesn't matter who's in office. That is something I'm very disciplined about. And also good communications with people on the Hill, other think tanks, other research institutes, and so forth. I think it's important to have these channels as a way to maintain communication when there are not too many other channels, even though it's informal. But also sometimes you can float proposals. Like, what do you think about this? Would this work? It's also an opportunity to, try to identify some common interests in the daily din of, high tension rhetoric. Rarely you get to do that. But it's also an important opportunity to sit down and say, these are our red lines. This is my understanding of my government's red lines. What are yours? So that we don't cross them. And then you'll find that there's a lot of misperception. A lot of, North Korea gets a lot of its information I was, I asked, how do you get your information about the United States? Well, they watch CNN quite a lot. And, that's a source for sure. But, having access to other perspectives and other sources, I think, is important too. So it covers a whole range, but it's completely informal and unofficial.
From a listener here, what would North Korea have to gain from a better relationship with the U.S.? You're talking about this, they see the U.S. as an existential threat.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
what,
at present they do.
mhm. So,
And they see that their nuclear program is protecting them from our aggression. So again, they saw what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. We negotiated his nuclear program away from him. He literally put it in boxes and shipped it out of the country, and yet he ended up dead. They see what happened to Saddam Hussein. He, didn't have a nuclear program, but we thought he did, but we still identified him as a threat that needed to be eliminated. And he's no longer with us. And then in the case of Qasem Soleimani, which is the most recent, we see a country like Iran that has opted not to go the nuclear weapons route. And Qasem Soleimani was killed on a government official on the territory of a neighboring sovereign state, Iraq. So this is what worries the North Koreans, is that they may be next. And to get them to give up their nuclear program in the current context is just impossible. I just don't see them doing it. Could we get to a place where they start drawing down? For example, maybe start with a freeze on current capabilities, that they won't make more nuclear fuel or more missiles. They'll just keep what they have and they'll open it up to inspection. I think that's something worth trying for. And what would they get out of it? Sanctions relief. They would get to trade with some other countries, particularly openly and legally with their logical trading partners. I mean, one of the mistakes I think the Trump administration made, and you'll maybe remember this from the Singapore summit, they put together a video that was quite bizarre. And they showed it to Kim Jong-un and his people around him. And it showed Singapore as this bustling economic, thriving economy, which it is. And they were trying to sell it like this could be you. That is Kim Jong-un's worst nightmare. He doesn't want a completely open economy. I mean, he sees that as being the end of his regime. What he's looking for is to be able to trade with North Korea's traditional trading partners like China and Russia and others, openly and legally. And I think the key goal here is to maintain and preserve his regime. And I think that is the sort of relief that he's looking for.
Some questions about curiosity about your career. How did you get involved in back channel work to these countries, and why? It's obviously very important to you. You have a lot of passion, a lot of enthusiasm for it. What are your motivations with this, and how did you begin this kind of very interesting and unusual career?
Well, I really, very early in my career, I was working at a think tank nonprofit. I was just out of college, and they were doing track two with, it was just the Soviet Union was just turning into Russia, just transitioning. It was the fall of the Soviet Union. And my job was to meet the visiting Soviets at the airport, pick up their luggage, take them to their hotel, and set them up for these meetings. And it was just very interesting to see the conversations were so frank. On the American side, it was people like Brent Scowcroft, Condi Rice, very young Condi Rice, Joe Nye, others. And on their side were a group of decision makers from Moscow. And after the Soviet Union fell, this group actually went on to become the foreign minister of the new Russia, the economic minister of the new Russia. And I saw how that process played out over time. And I really thought, wow, my interest in countries where we don't have relations, what if we did this with them? It was that's how the germ of the idea was formed. And I really found it appealing. I talked to people who worked in government. It was something I considered. But one of the things they said to me is, Suzanne, if you come into government, chances are you'll never set foot in Tehran or Pyongyang or meet officials from either country because we don't have relations with them. So that's when I think my entrepreneurial spirit kicked in. And I thought there might be some room here for an independent, unofficial sort of approach. And luckily, I was young when I thought of this because I was quite naive and I didn't really understand how much work it would take to get these initiatives off the ground. But in retrospect, I'm glad that I did. And what I try to get out of it is really, I have a very firm belief in diplomacy. What I've seen over the course of my career is our go-to position has been use of force, war, whether it is Afghanistan now in its 20th year, or Iraq, and the global war on terror. I live in New York City in downtown and was here when the towers were hit, which I could see right from my front door. The global war on terror as the organizing principle of our foreign policy, how we engaged with the world, has dominated our outreach with the world over these decades. And I've always believed that war should be a last resort, a tool of last resort, and that diplomacy should be a tool of first resort. But over these years, it seems like diplomacy has been a tool of last resort. So that's why I think I devoted my career. And looking back, I think the 9/11, that war in Afghanistan had a big impact on me. And of course, growing up, I'm half Japanese and half Italian, and I think knowing a lot about World War II always interested me. The atomic bombings of Japan. I think that's what opened my eyes to the importance of diplomacy and avoiding war.
Oh, it's wonderful, powerful, powerful statement.
Mm.
Tell us a little bit about the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. We mentioned that in your bio. It's something that you recently co-founded. Why did you get that started, and what is the Quincy Institute about?
So first of all, if you're thinking of starting a think tank during a pandemic and an economic downturn, think twice. But this was an idea that some colleagues and I have been thinking about for quite some time. And it really grows out of what I was just saying, how US foreign policy over these last couple of decades, the formative years of our careers, really, has been so dominated by almost a knee-jerk go-to military position. Also that we have to have military supremacy everywhere in every corner of the world, that we have to have 800 military bases, a defense budget of 760 billion, I think it is, nuclear budget, hundreds more millions. And I think, certainly when we launched Quincy, it was to address these issues and really point to another way, military restraint, more diplomacy, more economic statecraft, so forth. But I think when COVID hit, which we didn't see coming, we really understood that we were onto something, because all of these billions, I mean, between the war in Afghanistan, the Iraq war, and so forth, we've now spent, I think, over $6 trillion on waging those wars. And yet we were not able to protect ourselves from this pandemic and how it's wreaked havoc on us, on our families, on our economy. And I think the time is right for Quincy was formed to open up debate on these very issues. What are our priorities, our Americans, how we spend our resources, how we engage with the world. Are we really prioritizing the right things? And I think it's really become a big question out in the open now. And I just feel really fortunate that we have an organization that has been thinking about these issues and is ready to put out some ideas of whether it's reducing our military footprint in the Middle East, engaging with China on climate change, finding solutions to the war in Yemen. These are the things that we're attempting to do. And the response has been really great, and not only in the United States, but also worldwide. And we're really heartened by it.
Well, Suzanne, you've been a marvelous guest. You've given us so much to think about, and we're very, very grateful to you. Thank you for the important work that you do, and best wishes in it. And if people who are listening want to keep track of what your latest exploits are, what your endeavors are next, how can they do that? How can they keep track of what you're up to?
Well, my home base is Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can go to their website. Also, the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, go to their website. I'm also a fellow at SIPRI, which is the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute in Sweden. And they do some terrific work, especially on military spending and so forth. And then you could always follow me on Twitter. I'm not very active, but occasionally I get a burst of activity.
Well, again, Suzanne, thank you so much. It's been a delightful hour, very sobering content, but very helpful to ponder this with you. And you've got so much experience in it. Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much. And,
thanks for having me.
Sure. And if you'd like to continue our dialogue on Korea, you can join us for the debut of the Global Mixer this Wednesday night at 7 p.m. And you can register at worldmichigan.org/Great Decisions 2021. It'll be an informal setting via Zoom. It would be like if we had just gone out to a place in town right after this presentation and had the conversation going. And too bad Suzanne's not with us in person, because that's what we would be doing. But you'll be able to reflect. We'll talk more about Suzanne's presentation, about Korea, about the food and culture as well, and some on-the-spot polls and giveaways. So that's Wednesday night at 7, our first Global Mixer. Go to worldmichigan.org/Great Decisions 2021. And our next speaker in the Great Decisions series will be a week from today on Monday, February 15, when Andrew Natsios from the Bush School of Government and Public Affairs at Texas A&M will talk about, have we learned anything about this pandemic? Tonight's program will be archived on YouTube. And now that you're on our YouTube site, I'll end by saying, please subscribe and like our channel before you sign off. Please join us again, and may all everywhere in the world stay safe and be well. See you next time.